Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in downtown Washington, D.C. at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at the conclusion of a panel discussion chaired by the CEO of CSIS, John Hamre, on space and the prospect of creating a space force that had on the panel retired United States Air Force General Bob Kehler, who was head of Space Command and also U.S. Strategic Command, Tish Long, who was the NGIA, the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency Chief, Sean O'Keefe, who was a former Navy Secretary and NASA Administrator, and our next guest, Bob Work, the former Deputy Defense Secretary. Bob, it's always a treat. Thanks very much for taking some time and talking to us. It was a fascinating discussion. The overwhelming tone of it was that the creation of an independent space force, as advocated by President Trump, was not a good idea. You had literally about 120 years plus of national security experience on the stage. From your standpoint, what are some of the big pitfalls with creating this as somebody who was Deputy Secretary and had jobs in the Pentagon for a long time?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thanks a lot. And I'd like to just correct one thing that you said. I don't think the panel came out and said that an independent space force is necessarily a bad idea. What I think they all said, and me included, is that the steps that have been taken by the Department of Defense right now are very consistent with the President's vision and actually work towards that end without a massive disruption. And I give great kudos to Deputy Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan, who was told by the Secretary of Defense, hey, I need you to study this. What are the steps we have to take? And the steps that he made were all extremely pragmatic, executable without major disruption to the department. So the first thing he said is we're going to create a unified command. I don't think he necessarily said it explicitly, but I would expect that the Air Force Space Command is kind of the shell. The reason why that's important is the people are already there. It will not require a long time of transferring people to and from so that we can get this going. We might go through a phase of a sub-unified command to a unified command, but that makes perfect sense. We used to have a unified command for space. We got rid of it, I think, in 2002 because at that time great power competition was not a big deal. Everything really was about, obviously, the global war on terror, as it was called at that point. And so it made sense, I guess, to get rid of it. I thought it was a mistake, but we're bringing that back. The second thing is we have a Space and Missile Center that really develops SMC, develops space capabilities for the U.S. Air Force and for the Joint Force. And that is going to become the shell for a new space defense agency. And what Deputy Secretary Shanahan has said he wants is a culture of innovation and agility, really focused on applications and capabilities and getting to the field faster. And that's all to the good. If that happens, that's going to be really great. And again, using an existing organization and then reshaping it is the least disruptive thing you can do. And the final thing he said is, let's consider all the space operators in the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines. Let's consider them all part of a unified space operations force like we consider all of our special operators, our special operating forces as part of a unified force, even though they're in different services. And that's going to help on the culture side, getting the warfighting culture imbued among our space warriors. I thought General Kehler was extremely eloquent in this regard, where he said, hey, there are space operators who fly satellites, and then there are space tactical operators who think about how would I operate this satellite if I'm under attack, and how would I maneuver the satellite, what would I have to do? And so I think all three of the steps that Deputy Shanahan said, let's go, were really consistent with what the President wants and gets us along that line. And now we can debate, okay, should it be a separate service inside the Department of the Air Force? There are pitfalls to that. Do we want it to have a separate, totally separate service, a U.S. Space Force, all on its own? Do we want to have more of a National Guard or Coast Guard model, a Space Guard? All of these should be debated thoroughly by Congress because they have the authority and responsibility to determine whether or not we're going to stand up a separate service. And I don't think we've had any of those debates yet. I think we've had a lot of opinions. but what we need is to really look at them. And in the meantime, the department's off and running.
Look, I mean, that's true that General Kehler has said, and he reiterated, at some point a Space Force may be necessary, but not anytime soon. But I was channeling a little bit. You substituted a profanity for why you didn't think parts of it was a good idea. A lot of self-control there, Bob. Well done. And we did hear from Sean O'Keefe, who just said, look, this is a solution to something, to a problem that we really don't have at this point. The insinuation by so many is that somehow the Air Force has been chronically sort of underinvesting in space or short-sheeting the senior leadership. You heard from General Kehler, who's been a space officer and missile officer his entire career, added that certainly was not the case, that somehow this is a put-upon community. And you responded pretty strongly to that, given the fact that you were the Deputy Secretary at the time. Talk to us a little bit about how you respond to those folks in Congress who say that somehow, we're looking at a train wreck effectively, in part because of sort of underinvestment and a lack of focus. How do you respond to folks who say that?
Well, it's very frustrating to me. The department has long valued and understood just how important space capabilities are. And it's been that way since 1990 when Desert Storm, which is called the first space war, and as General Kehler said, that demonstrated that we are going to take the national security space constellation, which at that point had been focused on the National Command Authority, preparing for and fighting through a nuclear exchange. And we were going to take all those eye-watering capabilities and focus them on the warfighter. And that's exactly what we've done since 1990. We had a unified space command for the longest time. In 2002, we decided because there was no great power competition, we didn't need it anymore. But that didn't mean that the Air Force stopped caring about space. One of the things I say is look at the people that have been groomed by the U.S. Air Force to become space operators. General Hyten, who's now the commander of Strategic Command and was the former commander of Air Force Space Command. General J. Raymond, who is the commander. These guys are preeminent space warfighters, and you simply couldn't have grown them and groomed them for these type of capabilities or these type of positions of authority unless the institution was making sure that they had. Now, up until 2013, it is true, I said, I can't speak authoritatively for the Bush administration, but I was part of the Obama administration, first as the Undersecretary of the Navy and next as the Deputy Secretary. And it is true that the Obama administration did not want the department to talk overtly about space warfighting. They felt that this would be bad, that it would maybe lead to more offensive operations in space, our competitors saying, hey, we have to get after this. But in June 2013, there was a very important presentation to the President Obama, and the National Security Council, given by then Deputy Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. And it was all about the threats to our defense, our space constellation. From that point on, the White House was fully supportive of all Department of Defense efforts to really go after capabilities that would allow us to fight that constellation's under attack. So we did many, many things. We started with a thing called the Joint Interagency and Combined Space Operations Center, JICSPOC in DoD speak. That is now known as the National Space Defense Center. It is a center that looks up at the space constellation and says, are our assets under attack? If they're under attack, what do we do? Do we maneuver satellites? Do we try to shoot down the anti-satellite missile that's coming up? What do we do? So it was the very first organizational construct of the third offset strategy. So it's not like space wasn't viewed as important.
If you didn't think it was a priority, you wouldn't have made it the most important priority of your biggest priority when you were in office.
Second thing we started under Admiral Cecil Haney, who was a strategic commander, U.S. strategic commander, as a space tactics doctrine and tactics forum. We couldn't call it the Space Warfighting Forum, so we called it Space Doctrine and Tactics. And what they would do is say, okay, what are the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we're going to have to develop? And they would feed those back into, at that time, the JICSPOC, which would do experiments. Okay, we can actually do what you think we ought to be doing. And it was a closed-loop system, very like the interwar period between Naval War College and the fleet problems. The Schriever War Games, which I didn't mention today, brought in all of our allies, and we would go to the war games, and we would have all of our allies have a contingent, and they would right there with us in the war game and say what would happen. It was very interesting because in most cases, our allies have to go get parliamentary or presidential approval to execute space maneuvers, etc. And we worked all of that out. We tried to strengthen the Space Council, which would provide input into the budget and say, here are the priorities that you need to spend. And I will tell you, Vago, without question, we spent as much money in space as we could under the Budget Control Act limits. Everyone was, I mean, people could look at us and say, you didn't spend enough on readiness. You're right. You didn't spend enough on Army and Marine Corps ground modernization. You're right. You didn't spend enough on facilities maintenance. You're right. You didn't spend enough on cyber. You're absolutely right. You didn't build enough ships. Well, in all those areas, there were competing demands, and we made priorities, and we spent to the limit of the resources that we had. And so I would argue right now very, very strongly that we are well ahead on the road to where the President and Congress wants to go, to have a very, very robust and vibrant space force. And as I said, look, this is the first way I respond to people that say, hey, you haven't paid enough attention to space. We have the best national security space constellation in the world. It's not even close. So to people who say, oh, you haven't paid enough attention to space, I say, well, how do we have all these capabilities on orbit that are eye-watering? How do we have guys like John Hyten and Jay Raymond? How are we in a position now to really go forward as the President has asked? And we wouldn't have been able to do any of those things unless we were focused on space.
You mentioned the JIGSPOC up, and then the Space Operations Center was the one looking down, obviously, because 80% of space, as was observed, is actually in the hands of the military services and the space terminals in terms of how they use that, which is another headache because each of the space services within the services have, a challenge of not getting enough resources, because of obviously so many competing demands. I want to ask you, one of the other things that you said was very, very interesting was looking at how to respond to some of these challenges. And there are folks who are saying, hey, just throw up a whole series of much, much smaller spacecraft. And you just said, empirically, that doesn't work. So talk to us a little bit about the contested environment that's space. I remember, I covered Dazzlers, covered spacecraft, maneuvering spacecraft that our adversaries have that are either on intersecting orbits or get awfully close and sort of roost near some of our spacecraft. John Hamre talked about commercial, that some of these Russian and Chinese spacecraft are tracking even very, very important commercial constellation spacecraft. I mean, you mentioned one commercial spacecraft moving 3 times and being shadowed 3 separate times. As you look at this, there are guys who say, oh, the solution is CubeSats and microsats, but you view that as being something very, very different. Talk to us a little bit about why, this sort of simple idea is not really a panacea given the challenges we face up there.
Yeah, up until, I would say, 2010, 2011, most of our big national security satellites were big, exquisite platforms, very expensive, small numbers, big targets. And so the department and the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, started debate. And we looked at it from a position of space resiliency. If your constellation is under attack, how long can you maintain the terrestrial base support from that constellation? And you want to be as resilient as possible. So if you get into a shooting war, you want to make sure that you provide it for 65 days or 70 days. And you can, your analysis would then say, okay, how do you do this? How many do you start with? What type of stuff? And so there was a school of thought that said, hey, what we ought to do is protect the big boys. Put all of our money in defensive capabilities, have a lot of on-orbit defenses and stuff like that. There was a school of thought that says just proliferate the problem. Go with small satellites. Make millions of targets, not millions, but thousands of targets, and make it impossible for an opponent to service all of those targets over a 75-day period. And then there was a school of thought that said, hey, the best way you can tackle this problem is go to medium-sized buses that provide good resolution and good performance to support the National Command Authority and the ground commanders, but have enough fuel to do 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, where you do the analysis, burns, to get out of the way of an attack. And it became clear to us that for the basic stuff that we need to fight the war, medium-sized satellites with maneuver provide you with better resilience. What the small satellites do is complement those capabilities. They complement them especially in peacetime. You're going to have new on-orbit imaging constellations like Black Sky. They're going to have half-meter resolution, electro-optical resolution, and they're going to put, and they're going to have potentially infrared. You've got commercial companies like Hawkeye 360, which will be the first commercial RF, radio frequency collector, that you can buy the data for. They're doing it for things like illegal fishing and tracking dark ships that aren't using their AIS system. And then you have a company in Finland called ISI, which is going after SAR, synthetic aperture radar. So you're going to have commercial capabilities that in peacetime you're going to integrate into your systems, and they're going to be able to do change detection, support of small units without having to retask the big boys. All of that is being thought of. How do you do that? And as Tish Long said, who's the former head of NGA, as you said, there's going to be so much data coming down. How are you going to process it all? And that's going to be the role of artificial intelligence, and the intelligence community is all over that. In wartime, what will happen is all of these little small sats, they don't have any defenses on them. They can be easily jammed, for example, and easily dazzled. And so when operating over denied territory, they might not be able to provide you anything at that point in time. So we're trying to figure out what is the best way to combine the national security space constellation with these new and exciting commercial capabilities. And we have a space enterprise vision, which is an agreed upon vision between the Department of Defense and the National Reconnaissance Office that's kind of driving our architecture. So I'm very excited about what's happening. But for everybody who says, oh, we'll just put up small sats and little CubeSats, it doesn't work. The analysis shows that it will not provide you the resilience you need if a war starts.
Let me ask you one last question, because even though I would like to talk to you all day about this, you've got to go. One of the challenges, and came up in the conversation, and I think you're the one who raised it, which was you could accidentally have an exchange, not just from a situational awareness standpoint, but an adversary is approaching close to something that you hold dear. You may believe that it is, right? I mean, every war game, how does it start? It's an attack in cyber, it's undersea, or it's in space. Something that has a degree of plausible deniability. Well, an anchor fell on that fiber optic cable, which is why it was severed. Or, well, a hurricane put some of these out, or it was a storm. Or, well, it was a mysterious fire at a node somewhere. Similarly, in space, well, it was just debris that hit something. Well, debris didn't hit 3 of my satellites at the same time, right? What kind of, especially at a time when there were a lot of maneuvering spacecraft up there, things that are in an intersecting orbit, do we need to have a much clearer declaratory policy of what we will potentially respond to defensively if it appears to be something that is threatening? Do you need to do that in order to keep the peace? Because the United States has been a country that said, let's not weaponize space, let's not go there. Even at this point, there are folks, General Hyten is like, we shouldn't go there, but we have to prepare, which is something that you've said as well when you were in office. But talk to us about whether or not, as a strategist, as a first-order strategist, how do you need to approach that part of the problem with adversaries who are getting very, very close to being very provocative in what could be sort of a new hybrid space?
Well, there's a whole bunch in your question. So let me start to try to unpack it. If I forget anything, just prompt me. The first thing is, you're right. This is kind of like the lethal autonomous weapon debate, where everyone immediately goes to a general AI system where the weapon itself makes its own goals and can change its own goals. The Department of Defense is certainly not saying, hey, we ought to go after a weapon like that. What we're going after is a narrow AI system that says, okay, you will attack a tank. Now, you can decide how to attack the tank, Mr. AI, but you can't decide to go attack, a person. You're going to attack a tank. Militarization of space, to most people, I believe, is putting offensive weapons in space that you can deorbit to strike terrestrial targets. That would be my definition of militarization of space. Because the fact that you have a communication satellite up there that supports, or a GPS satellite that provides precision navigation and timing, I don't necessarily consider that the militarization of space. I consider that an operating domain that supports warfighters, and it's no different than air or sea or land. So militarization of space, I think, is a code word for kind of offensive operations. And the United States has said over and over again, we don't think we should go there. And if we ever thought that a competitor was going to go, I think at first we would try to do some type of arms control treaty, I think.
Well, that's right, because one of the things we didn't talk about, but you mentioned up there, was also kinetic, right? I mean, the real change moment was the 2007 Chinese anti-satellite weapon test that we were like, okay, well, we know the Russians have this capability. Now we know the Chinese have this capability, and sort of game on.
Right. So I've kind of lost track here on the thrust of the remainder of your conversation. First of all, militarization of space, we're using space as what I would call space-based combat support. Precision navigation and timing, communications, weather, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, things like that. And I don't necessarily consider that something that's threatening. Everybody knows that we're doing this, and everybody does it. But offensive weapons from space to ground would change the game. So, where else?
Well, but the other thing is that given that you've got dazzling, you've got jamming, everybody sort of understands that and can work through that problem. But when you're looking at potentially kinetic systems in space, in proximity to some of our most valuable spacecraft, I understand, maneuvering, I understand armoring and a whole bunch of other things which are very, very problematic in space anyway, but there are things you can do to protect the spacecraft. What I'm wondering is, do we need to have some form of declaratory policy that says, listen, you guys get within X distance of my spacecraft, and I reserve the right to respond however I see fit to that as a sort of, let's not go there, guys, because we don't want to be polluting. Well, but I mean, it's an important issue, right? I mean, if it's low enough, it'll deorbit, but if it's at a mid-range, like the Chinese satellite, it creates a debris field that's just gigantic, and folks will have to deal with it for a very long time.
Thank you for reminding me. I'm getting old and senile. Yeah, I mean, as you said earlier, in all of these war games where we're saying, how might a war unfold against a great power competitor? Generally, the war starts in operating domains that are hard to attribute action. And you mentioned undersea, like going after cables. Cyber attacks, very hard to attribute, especially in a timely manner. And then in space. And what happens in space is if you have maneuvering satellites and an adversary or a competitor satellite is getting closer and closer and closer to you, do you consider that a provocative act which would allow you to take self-defensive actions? Every commander has the right of self-defense. So if he ever thinks that his ship or aircraft or his ground unit is under attack, he can respond in kind. And so what is it in space? Where does it become to a point where you consider it so overtly threatening that you would want it to stand off? In these cases, I think that discussions with the Chinese and the Russians, rules of the road, like we did in the Cold War on collisions at sea, how far away would we all agree to keep orbiting assets from getting close? We certainly would. I think we wouldn't want to have any case where something gets close enough to grapple or put something, a tag on your
borders away. Space Marines will be added to board and seize that Chinese satellite.
And that's what you see in the press. there's maneuvering satellites that are doing things we don't understand, and we're trying to figure out, is this a threat? Is it just the way it maneuvers? And so I actually do believe, and at least in the Obama administration, I know they were thinking of how do we engage the Chinese and the Russians and say, what are the rules of the road here so that we don't start a conflagration? So, for example, one competitor says, wow, it's within 10 kilometers. That's too close. I'm going to have to take it out. And they take what they consider to be prudent self-defensive action, and it turns out that it was just, it was a maneuver that was designed for something else, and that starts the exchange. So talking with our competitors on this and having rules of the road, in my view, would be very, very, very helpful. Because it is very hard. In war games, for example, I've been in war games where Red, the bad guys, who are playing bad guys, maneuver orbital satellites close to all of our synthetic aperture radars. I'm just going to make that up, say. And so, wow, we've got 15 SARs up there. I'm making up numbers now, totally making them up. We have 15 SARs, and we've got 15 guys that are trailing them. That looks like a preemptive, getting ready for a preemptive attack. What do we do? Do we just start firing, or do we maneuver away? Do we try to de-escalate? Do we try to escalate? Having all of those kind of thought through and having some types of rules of the road would be very helpful, because the last thing we'd ever want to see is great power competitors getting into a shooting war through accident or misunderstanding.
And given the stakes, right, for every American, I mean, everybody depends on GPS, which is why President Obama was so concerned. I mean, that meeting, the nexus of it was the concern about the GPS constellation and the impact on people all around the world.
Yeah, there was, I mean, it was a 2013 presentation to the President of the National Security Council that said, look, we have all these threats. The Chinese and the Russians are both developing direct-to-send ASATs. They're both developing on-orbit ASATs. They have lasers. They have dazzlers. They have jammers. We could lose a good portion of all of the things that you, the National Command Authority, rely upon to make good decisions. And warfighting commanders would lose, something as simple as the ability to navigate easily, like they do today with GPS. So, as I said, from about 2013 on, it's been game on, and that's why I say I am very, very confident we have the best space constellation in the world. I'm very, very confident we have the best space constellation in the world by a wide margin. Our competitors are trying to threaten that, and they're also trying to develop their own capabilities. And since 2013, before that we were really thinking about it, but especially since 2013, I'd say for the last 5 years, the department has really, really been focused on how do we fight a war that extends from the Earth into space, and how do we protect these vital capabilities. And I'm here to tell you, Vago, if push comes to shove, I'm pretty confident. Never say never, never say always, but right now, my bet's on the U.S. Space Force.
Well, you should say U.S. Air Force, right, at this point?
Well, there is going to be a U.S. Space Force. That's what they're going to call the amalgamation
right.
of all of the space operators and all of the services. And, they're like the special operators. They're war fighters, man. They think every day about how they're going to create havoc and destruction. So that's just the kind of thinking that I like to hear about.
The one thing, though, I was reminded of as the debate was going on was a little bit, and I think General Kehler has said it in testimony, it's sort of a little bit like separating the submarine force from the Navy ultimately, right? It's a complex domain, the proportion of the size of the force, the irritation with the rest, not that you, in the Navy ever got any irritation from everybody else about how much money submariners were getting, and there is a little bit of an analog there, isn't there?
Yes, and that's why I say it's very important. And I'll go back again to what I said. I think what Deputy Shanahan did is said, Mr. President, we've heard you. We're on the way there. Here are the 3 steps we ought to take first. They'll be the least disruptive and the most consequential. In the meantime, we'll then come back to you and say, are we going to have a service inside the Department of the Air Force like we have the Marine Corps inside the Department of the Navy? Are we going to have an entirely separate Space Force? Is it going to be more focused, more like on the either the Coast Guard or the National Guard. How do we do that? And in the meantime, we don't lose a beat. We're just off and running. So I think what the department did was very consistent with what the President asked for, and is going to be very, very good for our warfighters.
Bob, Deputy Defense Secretary. Bob, thanks very much. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, thanks a lot, Vago. It's good to be here.